Last week, Sony officially pulled the plug on its brand new hero shooter Concord only 14 days after its release, with the game being pulled from stores and refunds being issued to anyone who purchased it. Concord failed to surpass even 1,000 concurrent players on Steam, and according to reports by analysts, sold fewer than 25,000 copies in its first week. Unfortunately for developer Firewalk Studios, the writing was on the wall weeks before the official launch when the open beta for the game itself failed to generate much attention. Having put a few hours into Concord myself, I wasn't expecting the game to do Helldivers 2 numbers, but in no way did I think that a first-party Sony game would bomb this hard. The gunplay is actually really solid, and I found a fair number of the heroes fun to use. The game was polished and played well, but when compared to its peers, I lost interest pretty quickly, and haven't felt the pull to go back and keep playing. Concord just didn't have anything really unique about it. Its game modes were a mix of team deathmatch, kill confirmed, and domination, and that's all the game really had in it, which isn't nearly enough to entice players to drop $40 on a premium multiplayer experience in 2024. The market is saturated with free-to-play options that offer way more content and unique modes, and pulling players away from the games that they've invested years of their lives into at this point requires more than just pretty visuals and good gameplay. What exactly that is, I couldn't tell you, and neither can the dozens of other failed hero shooters, looter shooters, battle royales, or extraction games. According to Firewalk's lead character designer, and I apologize for butchering this name, John Wyszynski, Concord was somehow in development for almost 8 years. That's a lot of time for a game that was only revealed a few months ago, didn't spend much time building community ahead of launch, and wanted to enter a market that is fiercely competitive and quite cynical in the online space. If Concord had launched in 2016, it would have been right around the rise of Overwatch, PUBG, Fortnite, and many other of the behemoths of the multiplayer shooter market, and possibly have found its audience. 8 years on though, and now you're competing with games that have been around for almost a decade, invested billions of dollars into, and a graveyard of similar expensive canceled games that also tried and failed to make a dent. One of Concord's biggest selling points was that it was going to have weekly, expensive, narrative cutscenes that would tell the stories of the game's many free runners. I'm going to be frank for a moment here. As much as I like the gameplay of Concord, it's impossible to not feel extremely cynical about a multiplayer action game championing cutscenes as a unique selling point in 2024. There's zero connection between the player and the character, considering the gameplay itself has zero character to it. Matches are just like any other multiplayer FPS that has no story attached to it, just shooting other players in the face to rack up more points. I cannot fathom why so much money would be invested into weekly narrative cutscenes that serve absolutely no purpose to the gameplay of Concord. In fact, in that opening cutscene, there's not even a narrative hook for me to get invested in. It's just a ragtag group of characters sitting around a computer talking. There's no action, there's nothing interesting that happens, and by the time that scene is over, I was already checked out, as I'm sure many others were as well. Then when you start the game itself, the story has zero attachment to the game, not even through the objectives you're completing in matches. Playing my first rounds of Concord, I was expecting the opening of the match to include some narrative beat or some unique objective tied to the character motivations presented in the cutscenes, but there was nothing. Couple that with the lack of any real character progression through unlocks outside of cosmetics, and the only reason I have to come back every week is for a cutscene for a story that failed to hook me in the first place. In 2016, this may have been a unique concept for the games industry. A hero shooter with a weekly narrative for players to get invested in. In 2024, every hero shooter on the market has years of lore built up, spin-off games, comics, and even shows on Netflix. These games have cornered the market, and another game that looks slightly different than what's already out there isn't going to attract players to it. Pair that with something that lacks any real identity, going all the way back to the original poorly received trailer that premiered at the Game Awards, and a $40 price tag, and you have a recipe for disaster. I feel for the devs at Firewalk, as this was a lose-lose situation for them. Cancel the game you spent years working on, or put it out there and just hope for the best. I think I'm actually more surprised by how quickly Sony pulled the plug. It's not unheard of for games to have rough launches and come out the other end of things stronger. Rainbow Six Siege, one of my favorite games to this day, had a rocky start with lots of server issues and bugs. It had a steady player base, but the functionality of the game was quite dire, and by its second year, it needed an entire season of the game, dubbed Operation Health, dedicated to getting the game into the state it needed to be successful long term. Luckily for Rainbow Six Siege, the game had a very solid core concept and gameplay that carried it beyond its initial issues, whereas Concord just doesn't have that gameplay hook that's needed to keep players invested for the long haul. Maybe we'll see Concord come back as a free-to-play game, and that's why Sony made this decision so quickly so that they wouldn't have to issue even more refunds later down the line. But considering the lack of excitement around the launch of the game in general, I'm not holding out much hope for that outcome. Concord is yet another harsh reminder for the games industry that the huge amount of investment needed for these endless live service games is most often not worth the cost, and it's the developers that get punished for it in the end. Sony had big ambitions for entering the live service space, but between their many cancelled games and now the failure of Concord, there isn't a whole lot left in that pipeline. Their next big live service title is supposed to be Haven Studios' Fair Games, which was also met with a similar muted reaction when it was revealed. If I were working on that game, or working with Sony on live service games in general, I'd be building a plan B.